The next requirement of this exam says to implement and manage hybrid identities. Now, the concept of hybrid anything within Microsoft Azure basically is a combination of on-premises services with Microsoft Azure services. So hybrid identities is the concept of having an on-premises identity provider that integrates with Azure Active Directory. If I go into the settings option of my Active Directory, I can see Azure AD Connect as being one of the options. This screen contains a number of things that you can set up in order to implement hybrid identity. The first option is synchronization. The concept of synchronization is that you have an Active Directory, a Windows Server Active Directory on premises that already contains the user IDs and passwords and other information about all of your corporate users. You can then synchronize that information into Azure Active Directory, and in this case, Azure Active Directory becomes an extension of your already existing user ID and password model, but for the cloud. You'll see it tells me I have to download the Active Directory Connect software. So that'll take you to a page like this where you have to basically download a version of AD Connect, and basically you're going to install that inside of your network and have to set that up so that it can synchronize with the Active Directory, Azure Active Directory running in the cloud. Okay, so that is the foundation of installing and configuring AD Connect. Once you've got that going, it'll do a synchronizations, and you can basically understand that the same users that are registered in your on-premises Active Directory can then use those user ID and passwords in the cloud. And if they change their password inside of the network, then that change gets propagated into the cloud automatically. Now, it's not instantaneous, but it's fairly low latency, shall we say. Now, to take that a step further, so that's sort of the basic level of synchronization, the basic level of extending your on-premises identities into the cloud in a hybrid model. If we want to get even fancier, we can implement something called federation. Now, federation, whenever you see this word mentioned when it comes to identity, it's the concept of letting another system that is not this system handle the user IDs and the passwords. And you basically trust that system. If that person's able to log in the other system, then you can basically trust they are who they are, where they say they are. So in this case, with federation, you can, instead of synchronizing the passwords into the cloud, and then when they log into cloud, the password is checked into a cloud-based directory. If you did federation, then you would not have these users in your user table, but the authentication would be done by your on-premises server, and then it would report back that the person successfully signed in and you're able to go on and use them. So federation is almost an alternative to synchronization, because you're basically not trusting the local in this case is in the cloud copy of the passwords, but you're basically sending them to the on-premises to get authenticated. The single sign-on option is the concept of, you've already logged in. Let's say you log into your Windows computer at work and it's on the network. Then to be able to access cloud-based applications and not have to sign in, right? So the seamless part is that you do not have to put your user ID and password in every single place that you need to use it. It's the fact that the server recognizes that you're already signed in. So if we go into this option, if we had on-premises domains configured, then we could say, oh, we want to allow people who signed in using this domain for those keys are basically going to be synchronized and not the passwords, right? So those, and then pass-through authentication, again, similar to federation, is the user, instead of logging into this Active Directory, is passed through to the on-premises server or another authentication agent, and then when they successfully authenticate it, then the Azure Active Directory accepts that as being a valid thing. So these are your hybrid identity options within Microsoft Azure. So in this section of the course, we're going to be talking about Azure virtual machines and how to manage them, add new network interfaces, data disks, change their VM sizes, redeploy them, etc. So in this video, let's talk about data disks. Now, it might not be obvious, but when you create a virtual machine, you create a machine and you also create what's called an operating system or a temporary disk. So this virtual machine that we created a few lessons ago has an operating system disk of 128 gigabytes basically. And this is using managed storage, so we don't have to worry about allocating this, etc. But 128 gigabytes is for the operating system, and we don't really have a lot of local storage if we needed it. If you need to run workloads on your virtual machine that need to access disk, you've got a lot of different options, including the Azure Files option we talked about previously, or using blob accounts, other external storage. But if you needed storage to be attached to this machine, the option is called a data disk. And so you go into the VM under the disks section, and you're going to want to say add data disk. So right now we do not have any unused managed disks because we are using managed disk in this VM. So we're going to need to create a new managed disk. So we're going to call it SJD new managed disk. We're going to put that into the 102 resource group along with the existing virtual machine. Our location, because it's a managed disk, is not choosable. There's no availability zone concept at this time. Premium SSD. Now the question is, where do we want this managed disk to come from? It could be empty. We could back up a snapshot of let's say take a snapshot of a VM and have that restored. We could take contents of a storage blob. So let's start with an empty disk, and we get to choose the size. Now remember, in storage you are charged basically for the size. So this would be 1 terabyte. So you'll see here that it's giving me, because it's a premium drive, we've got 5,000 operations per second limit, 200 megabits per second limit. I'm going to say create. Alright, so we've attached, we haven't hit the save button yet, but it's basically created the managed disk, and we can say that's the disk that we want, okay, and we can say save. And so now, once this is updated, our virtual machine will have the operating system disk, which is like the C drive, and it'll have a data disk that's attached. That could be like the D drive, okay? And so this virtual machine will have a place to store files that will be preserved if the virtual machine gets eliminated and gets recreated. Now the other thing that we can do with these disks is we can detach them, and then we can attach them to another virtual machine. So data disks are actually portable. Now you cannot attach a data disk to more than one machine at the same time, okay? But you can detach them and reattach them. Now I will point out that when you created this virtual machine, one of the decision points that you were going to make is how many data disks it can have. So you can see that this is a B1MS virtual machine, and there's a limit of 2 data disks. So I knew that I had a maximum of 2 data disks. If I needed more, if you need 4 or 8, then you are forced to go to a larger virtual machine. This is the same for the D series. Some series like the E series seem to contain 8, 16, 32 large numbers of options, but as you're choosing your virtual machine instance type, you are also getting a limit on the number of data disks that you can have. So that's how you add or remove a data disk from a virtual machine. Alright, in this section we're going to talk about app services. Now we just finished talking about the application service plans, and inside those application service plans are apps. Now, in the past, we used to call these web apps or API apps or mobile apps, but within Azure, all three of them have the same capabilities. So we can choose any of these apps and go into it, and they're called app services. Now, app services are assigned a URL on creation. So when we created this app service, we got a URL that had the name of the app service as part of the URL. In this video, we want to talk about assigning an SSL certificate to this. Now we can see that the app service is automatically assigned an SSL certificate, and so this URL is actually accessible over HTTPS. But it also works without HTTPS, so you can address this website either securely or not securely. Let's go down into the Settings tab under SSL Settings. Now we can see under Protocol Settings that we have a few options. One of them is we can turn this website into HTTPS only. That means that the HTTP version of the website would not work. So if I was to do this, then you are forced to address this website using HTTPS. Now the TLS version has recently become an issue because it's been determined that older versions of TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are no longer secure, and so web browsers are even being updated so that they don't support it. So the minimum TLS version is set to 1.2 by default, and that is the secure version. Now, if you do have clients on older operating systems with older web browsers that can't be updated, for instance, if you have an old version of Android and it doesn't support updating to a new version, you might be forced to reduce the minimum TLS version in order for those clients to be supported. But you really should be on 1.2 in order to be secure. We also have other settings in terms of using client certificates on incoming traffic. So we require people to have the right certificate in order to reach the app. There is a valid certificate required in order to reach the app. We won't get into that. Now, we do not, because this website is defined as as a default URL. If we go back to the overview page, we can see that it's azurewebsites.net. That is that Microsoft is able to generate a certificate that does encompass, it's probably a wildcard certificate that encompasses all of the azurewebsites.net domains. If we were to get into custom domain names, then we would need to supply a SSL certificate that supported that domain name. So if we were to have a customized domain name, which is the setting above here, if we wanted SSL supported on that domain, then we would need to generate an SSL certificate specifically for that domain, because the domain name is embedded in the SSL certificate name. So in this section, we're going to talk about subscriptions. Now, in the previous exams, such as 7533, didn't really cover subscriptions that much, but this exam seems to have a few more topics on it, so let's get into it. I am in the Azure portal, as you can see, and I'm going to go over to All Services, which is these three lines on the left, and I can actually see subscriptions is like the third one down. I have it as a star. It's also this key on the menu as well. Lots of ways to get there. Now, I click into it and I can see that I only have one subscription. Now, this is going to be a bit different for each of us. I have a pay-as-you-go subscription. You might have the free plan. You might have the an enterprise plan or an MSDN subscription. There's 12 or 15 different subscription options. So mine's a pay-as-you-go plan. I'm going to go into it here. We can minimize that section. So this is what you see when you go into the subscription section. Okay. Now they're focusing on the cost here, so this is how much cost I've incurred so far this month. There's a forecast, etc. First thing we're going to talk about is access control. So one of the requirements of this exam is to be able to assign additional administrators or to basically give people access to your subscription. Go into the Access Control IAM tab here on the settings. Now, by default, it's going to contain my account. I was experimenting with CloudDin, which is a Microsoft company that manages costs within Azure. And then there's some other things here for other apps that were requesting permissions. So my layout is extremely simple. You might have obviously a more complicated layout. Let's add another administrator. So let's say I don't want to be the only one that can manage resources on this account. I want to be able to add another person. So I go up to the Add tab. Now, first I'm going to choose a role. So what type of role are we going to assign to this person? Well, for an administrator account, then you're going to assign owner roles. Okay. This person's going to have access to my Azure AD it's going to be an Azure AD user. And now I can choose other people. So I'm going to choose another one of my accounts and I'm going to say save. So if I scroll down here, now under the owner role, I can see the account that I created it under. And then I also have an additional account that has owner access to this resource. So again, what this means is that if I was to log into Azure using this account, then I would have full access and control to the account. I can create resources, delete resources, add more users here. Like you've got basically full access, including the ability to grant other people access. So this is a full-on administrator. So that's how you add administrators. Now, of course, removing them is just as simple. Selecting it, saying remove, and saying yes. Got to make sure that I'm not deleting something that I don't intend to. But basically, adding and removing access to your Azure subscription is done through the subscription section under access control. So that's pretty straightforward there. So talking about Active Directory, really we've been talking about identity, right? This is identity as a service. Also, it could be authentication as a service. Basically, we have users. Those users have passwords. If we have MFA enabled, then they have to provide a code. And those three pieces of information basically prove to us that they are who they say they are. And that's the authentication aspect of it. But once they're authenticated, what can they do? What is their authority? What is their authorization? And so we haven't to this point talked about authorization. To do that, we're going to get out of Active Directory and we're going to go into, in this case, a resource group. Now, when you go into any particular resource within Azure, you will see typically this access control setting. Not only is it there for the resource group level, but if we were to go down into a resource itself, which hopefully this won't take too long. So even within a virtual machine level, we do have this access control setting. Go back up to the resource group level. But go into access control. This is where it allows us to control access to whoever's going to be able to get into this resource group, who's going to be able to see the resources, who's going to be able to modify anything, add new resources, or even in the case of owners, create new users who can then access those things. So check access, right? So we can basically say, let's see as if John Doe, I've got a user named John Doe. Let's see what John Doe's permissions are. John Doe has no permissions, right? He's not allowed, he's not denied. Basically, he would not be able to see any of these resources because nothing allows him to do it. But what if we wanted John Doe to be able to access those virtual machines or to access the Logic app in this case? This, what we want to do is we want to add a role assignment. Now, I'm going to go into this role assignments here. By default, you're going to have some role assignments. Some of them are going to be inherited from the subscription level. So we can go into the subscription level and look at the access controls in there. You can see them all here being inherited. I don't have any access that's been specifically granted to this resource group that is not just inherited from above. Okay. My main account is in there. CloudDin is a cost tracking application. Some of these are automatic, so the service principal and things like that. Automation accounts that create accounts for themselves. Okay. So let's say we wanted to add a John Doe to have access. Now, first we have to decide what role we want to give John Doe. The three main roles that you need to understand are owner, contributor, and reader. You can see that there are dozens of other roles, and we'll get into them in a second. But the top three, owner, contributor, and reader, are key. The reader role, as the name suggests, just gives you read-only access to those resources. That means that if you logged into the portal, you can see the resource group, you can go into the resource group, you can see the resources there, you can click into the resources and you can see them, but you can't make any changes. You can't stop them, you can't edit them, you can't delete them. Read-only access is the reader role. Now the contributor role is like a full set of permissions. You can go into a resource group in this case, create resources, delete resources, edit resources. You just can't give that permission to other users. So you're a full-on manager of these resources, but you can't make your friend a manager as well. The owner permission is the most powerful, and this, more than anything, is the keys to the castle. So do not hand out owner permission to your account or to specific resource groups unless you really know what you're doing. But the owner permission basically allows you to manage everything just like a contributor, and you can also grant access to other users. And so your friend can also get contributor access, and your other friend can also get owner access, etc. So that's reader, contributor, and owner. Now as we scroll down these lists of other predefined roles, you can see very similar naming like backup reader, backup contributor, backup operator, CDN endpoint contributor, CDN endpoint reader, etc. There's a lot of contributor and reader roles against many of the services inside of Azure, Event Grid, DocumentDB, Log Analytics, etc. So we basically have the ability to give very fine-grained permissions to individuals using role-based access control. I'm going to give our friend contributor access, John Doe. So I've chosen contributor, and I'm going to say I'm going to assign it to a user, and that user is John Doe, and it's selected John Doe. So once I save it, it's going to do a deployment that basically adds John Doe, and we can see John Doe, a user, has been given contributor access only to this resource group. So if we go back to check access and we check John Doe's access, now we can see he's got contributor permissions specifically assigned to this group. Okay, and so pretty much that's a role-based access control. Now we could obviously go in here, and if we wanted to ensure that somebody, no matter what permissions they have, that could be inherited, let's say that I want my other account specifically to be denied access. Okay, so my other account here is a denied access as a contributor. It's almost an opposite. It blocks users from performing specific actions, even if they've got access through some other way. Okay. So Scott Duffy was added contributor. So that's basically role-based access control. It can happen at the resource level, at the resource group level. We saw basically going into a subscription, we've got access control options at the subscription level. So you can just, for, in this case, I don't mind showing you, someone who works for me has contributor access to my entire account, and they can create resources, and I've given them permission to do so, right? And so we can see that basically this is one way of ensuring that people can either have access or be denied access. So that's the authority essentially to do things, as opposed to the authentication, which is taken care of by Azure Active Directory.
Hi there, and thanks for being here. I'm your instructor, Scott Duffy. I am so excited that you've signed up for this course, and I hope that you're excited to learn about developing for Microsoft Azure. In this section, I've already said what you need to get started with this course, and so hopefully you've got your Azure account already, you've downloaded and installed Visual Studio, and you've bookmarked the Azure Samples GitHub repository, okay? If you haven't done that, stop here and go do that. You're going to learn and remember more by attempting to do things yourself after watching the videos in this course. From time to time in this course, I'm going to pop back in and ask you to try something on your own as an assignment. So when you see these videos that are marked as activities, then be prepared to go into the Azure portal or into Visual Studio or into PowerShell and try it yourself. Don't be afraid of that. If you succeeded, it proves you've learned the topic, but if you fail at first and it takes you some time to figure it out, you've learned how to overcome those common mistakes. In this course, there's also going to be little quizzes that are meant to check your understanding of what was just taught in the preceding section. This is simply meant to improve your ability to remember what you've learned by forcing you to recall it. They're not supposed to be simulations of the real exam. If you find that you're not passing the little quizzes, feel free to go back and rewatch the lectures associated with those questions. Another tip is to take notes. A lot of students find taking notes is very helpful. Feel free to speed up the videos if I talk too slow. Sometimes I talk too slow, that's fine. You can also turn on closed captions if it will help you to follow along. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the appropriate section of the course. If you feel like you can help others with their questions, go ahead and answer some of their questions as well. If you're asked to leave a review while watching this course, I would be so grateful for your feedback and comments that will help this course get found by future students. I do read every review, and I'm grateful for that. Thanks for watching, and let's get into the first core concept of Microsoft Azure.
All right, in this section, we're going to be talking about one of the biggest topics in Azure. One of the most important topics as well is Azure Active Directory. Now, Azure Active Directory is a lot of things. Primarily, it's Microsoft's identity as a service solution, which means that when you're developing your own applications, you do not need to develop your own user management system where people can enter user IDs and passwords and you have to then store those and allow them to change their password, etc. You can basically offload your account management system to Microsoft's Azure Active Directory and then integrate those SDKs into your application. And you get basically all these features for free. Now, Active Directory also integrates with your corporate Active Directory, and so you can do synchronization that enables single sign-on, that allows people who have corporate accounts to be able to use that same account for your mobile apps and for your apps on the web, etc. Now, Azure Active Directory, as you would imagine, it's just got a lot of features and services. Let's go over to the Pricing Details tab here, and we're going to see the comparison between the different plans. Now, Microsoft has a free plan for this, so you can very well create an Azure Active Directory account for free, attach it to your subscription, and you basically get a lot of user management, add, update, delete. Users can, up to 500,000 objects can basically use your Azure Active Directory, 10 apps per user, etc. Now, there are also basic and premium plans. We won't focus on the Office 365 for now, but basic and premium plans. What you probably need to understand for this exam and just in general is what you get when you upgrade to the premium account, because you're going to see questions on the exam and you're going to have to decide whether this can be done using the basic account, the free account, or whether the person has to upgrade to premium. So basic and premium users, there are basically reporting features. Self-service password reset. Now that's a huge one where users can just go to a web page, you put their old password, set a new password, the forgot password functions, your company branding, any kind of logos, etc. on the logins. There's also a service level agreement that comes with the premium and basic. When we get into premium alone, which is not basic, then you've got the ability for them to do the password reset that synchronizes back to your Active Directory running on premises. So they can change their password in the cloud, and that changes their password within the corporate network. Right? So two-way synchronization between AD and Azure AD. Multi-factor authentication. So if you want people to have an app or receive an SMS code in order to log in. Automatic password rollover. Conditional access is great so that you can say that if somebody's using a device that you don't recognize, they have to provide multi-factor authentication, or if they're out of the country geographically, or if they're using their phone as opposed to their laptop. You can set different rules based on different properties of the user, device state, etc. So those are some of those premium features. And we're going to get some advanced features such as identity protection, privileged identity management. So if a super user or administrative user needs to go through extra hoops to log in versus a basic user, that's on the P2 plan. Okay, so basically I do recommend that you look at this feature. But in this section of the course, we're going to go through a lot of these requirements as specified in the exam requirements, and we're going to look at Azure Active Directory. So in this section, we're going to talk about some identity security services, particularly multi-factor authentication. Now, what is multi-factor authentication? Now, one of the big challenges with security these days is that people have user IDs and passwords, and no matter how complicated your password is, if it's 16 digits, contains letters, numbers, symbols, capitals, and funny foreign letter characters in the same password, if that password gets lost, someone breaks into your computer and steals it, or something becomes easy to guess, etc., that allows somebody to log in as you and basically be able to take over what it is that you have control over. So a user ID and password is not entirely secure simply because it can be lost. Now, when you add another factor to it, then that becomes even more secure. In this case, when they're talking about multi-factor authentication, it's either having a device, whether it could be your phone or in the old days they used to have key fobs with randomized numbers on them, or it could be a fingerprint or an eye scan, etc., retina scan. So the multi-factor authentication refers to having more than just your password as a way of authenticating. And that's why it becomes more and more common for you to require your phone, and either you get an SMS message, you get an email, or you get a randomized number in an application that you have to type in order to log in just beyond your password. Now, Microsoft Azure Active Directory does support this. Either you have to pay for it, so it is available as an add-on service. It costs $1.40 per month per user, so there is a billing model associated with that, unless you're a premium Active Directory user. So if you are running on a premium plan, then it is included in that plan. Now, how do you turn on Active Directory? So in this particular case, I go into Users. Now I have a mixture of native users, Azure Active Directory, and invited users. Invited users in this case are B2B. These are Gmail accounts in this particular case. Email went out to them, they accepted, and they are part of my Active Directory, but they are not Active Directory members because their email address isn't a controlled domain. So we have this new user and guest user concept. So once I'm in the users section of my Active Directory, you'll see it says multi-factor authentication at the top. When I click this, it's actually going to take me out of the portal into a separate website. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and we can see it is a Microsoft website, but it's basically completely different than the portal, and it's opened in a new tab of my browser actually. Now, out of my 5 users, remember 2 of them are actually Active Directory users and 2 of them are Gmail users, which are B2B. So I can actually only enable multi-factor authentication for 2 of those users. You can't enable it for users that are not part of your Active Directory as native users. So I've chosen the 2 of them, and I can click Enable. Now it says about enabling multi-factor. Basically, they're going to have to sign in through the web browser in order to sign up for app multi-factor authentication. If they access your services through their app, through some other method, might not actually work. So here's a link to how these individual users, Joe Green and John Doe, can sign up for MFA. But I control them, and so I can actually enable multi-factor. So now I've enabled multi-factor authentication on 2 users in my account, and that's basically how easy it is. Now, if I remember this is a separate tab, I can close the tab, go back to the portal. Now keep in mind that there is an impact on the support basically for your Active Directory. So now that you've got users that are forced to use multi-factor authentication, what you're going to end up with doing is people have their ID, they have their password, but they don't have their phone. Their battery has died, they lose their phone, or they changed their phone number, but they didn't migrate their multi-factor authentication. So there is another point of support once you make it more complicated for people to log in. But remember, security is not about convenience. Security in some ways is the opposite of convenience, because the more convenient you make something, the less secure it generally is. You're going to have to introduce things like this, having to have your phone to answer an SMS text or an app in order to log into your system as a way to increase security.